Hi, welcome to what we are calling Classic Bookmark. When we started shooting these interviews in the spring of 1988, we had no idea the show would go on for 30 years, with over 400 episodes. To celebrate and mark this achievement, we have selected 15 shows. Choosing was difficult. Most of the writers chosen, like Horton Foote and Ray Bradbury, are deceased. Others, like Toni Morrison, the Nobel Prize winner, are perfectly well, but I do not think we will be lucky enough to have them on the show again. We purposely did not include some bookmark favorites like Rick Bragg, Winston Groom, Sina Jeter Naslund, Brad Watson, Daniel Wallace, Michelle Richmond, and others, since we plan to visit with them regularly in the future. Viewers will notice that the technology has improved considerably in 30 years. We've cleaned these up the best we could. These first 30 years have been a lot of fun. I hope you enjoy watching these as much as I did making them. Michael Cunningham's third novel, The Hours, received the PEN/Faulkner Award and the 1999 Pulitzer Prize for Fiction, and it deserved them. It's partly about Virginia Woolf's suicide in 1941, and partly about a woman living in Greenwich Village in 1999. It's not necessary to have read Mrs. Dalloway by Woolf or to know much about Virginia Woolf to enjoy this novel, but it helps. Well, this is a great pleasure. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule today to come in and talk.
Thank you for having me.
This has been a great few months for you. You are now traveling around as the winner of the Pulitzer Prize.
Yeah.
For The Hours.
It's been huge in every sense, a huge surprise to begin with.
Well, you beat out some very fine books. It was a good year.
It was a great year, and I'm very happy to get the Pulitzer Prize. You notice I didn't give it back.
Let me see if I can characterize The Hours, because it's a structurally a fairly complicated book.
Yes.
It is about Virginia Woolf. There are three strands of narrative. One strand of narrative is Virginia Woolf and her husband Leonard as fictional characters. Yeah. Another strand of narrative takes place in New York City, where there is a woman whose nickname is Mrs. Dalloway. And then another strand, I think that the most mysterious is the strand that takes place mainly in California and involves a woman who turns out to be Richard's mother. I have a whole bunch of questions about your choices here. Let's start at a simple place. Why did you choose, what is your fascination with Virginia Woolf? Why write a novel in which Virginia and Leonard are fictional characters?
You know, Woolf's great novel, Mrs. Dalloway, was the first great book I ever read. I read it when I was 15 by accident because a girl I had a crush on kind of threw it at me and said, read this and try to be less stupid. And, and it knocked me out. And it turned on a little light over my stupid little head, and has always felt to me singular, as much an experience I had as a book I read. It's made me think that everybody who cares about books has a first book. Maybe not a great book, probably not the first book you ever read, but the first book that cracks it open for you, that shows you what books can mean to you. And that was Mrs. Dalloway for me.
And before you imagined writing Virginia as a fictional character, had you read a great deal of and about Woolf and the Bloomsbury Group? Is this something that you had immersed yourself in?
Yeah, though I immersed myself much more deeply when I started to actually write about Woolf and Virginia and her husband Leonard. And I did so with appropriate trepidations. This is, after all, somebody who really lived and due the respect that any living person is due. And of course, she was a genius. And if you stand too close to a genius, to someone of that stature, you run the risk of looking pretty tiny yourself. I knew it was a big risk trying to create a fictional character named Virginia Woolf, and almost didn't do it. And then I thought, well, why would you want to write a novel that didn't involve some kind of huge risk? What would be the fun of that?
Mm-hmm. So you, at that point, you went from casual Virginia Woolf fan to Virginia Woolf scholar.
Yes, and I still feel
because
like a drunken high school boy mistaken for a Virginia Woolf scholar.
Well,
maybe all purported scholars.
Your
feel that
sources
way.
and acknowledgments are pretty extensive. You did a lot of reading, a lot of work.
I wanted to get it as right as I possibly could. Yeah.
Okay. You got the facts right. I think more important than that, and more difficult, I'm sure, was that it would be difficult to write a parody of Virginia Woolf. But you didn't write a parody of Virginia Woolf. You wrote in the style of Virginia Woolf, and fairly successfully. Most of the time, it's amazingly like her syntax, her language. How do you do that? That's not just research. How do you get inside her head to write in her style?
Here's what I did. I was very anxious not to write, as you say, a parody of her, to try to actually duplicate her style. I would look like an idiot, and I couldn't do it. I did read everything of hers, immerse myself in her work as much as I possibly could, then closed all the books and started writing, and didn't let myself read any more Woolf as I was writing, so that I'd be writing in my own voice, as much influenced by her as I possibly could be, so that her cadences and her way of putting a sentence together almost felt like they were in my bloodstream.
So it's a question really of internalizing Virginia Woolf.
Of taking a Virginia Woolf pill and then writing as myself.
In this novel, why did you, I've noticed in several of your books, you tend to use multiple points of view, multiple voices. This is obviously a decision. It's a structural choice that you make. And in the hours, you use the three different narratives. Why do you do that? What's gained there?
You know, it's like much of what I do. It's some sort of queasy combination of decision and inclination and intuition. I write the book that seems like the book I want to write, need to write, ought to write. I suppose I could say that the world is just so big now and so complicated and so unknowable to any individual that you probably stand a better chance of telling some kind of meaningful story if you tell more than one story. And I seem to be drawn to multiple stories that span periods of time. Just trying to tell the biggest story I can out of my tiny little brain.
But you wanted, reading that book fresh, I knew very little about how it was going to end. I knew what it was to do, but I didn't know how it was to end. And as I was reading, I was watching those three strands resonate and finally come together.
Yeah.
It has a kind of detective, it has a kind of a whodunit quality to it.
Yeah, it has a surprise ending.
Well, of a sort, I guess.
Of a sort. Most people have been surprised by it. It's obviously not meant to be some sort of rabbit I'm pulling out of my hat. It's right there in front of you, but most people have said they didn't realize who was who and how the stories were actually going to converge at the end.
Right, and they do. And a person who was uncharitable would say, this is a wild and unbelievable coincidence that these people should be related in just this way. On the other hand, there is a kind of new age synchronicity at work here. When people ask you that, how do you respond to it?
You know, when you write novels and ask people to read them, you're always exposing yourself to the uncharitable, and I thank them for their feedback and go on about my business. It did seem that these three disparate strands needed to come together, that the reader needed and deserves some sense of completeness, that this adds up to something, that it comes to some kind of cathartic point. And I find that in writing, in finishing a novel, I always wonder about the other versions of the novel that I didn't write.
Sure.
You know, option B. in which they didn't come together like that, but just sort of meandered off on their own. I'll never know. But I wonder about that book.
That book is partly a West Coast book, partly a New York City book. You are a native originally of the West Coast and now live in New York City.
Right, I'm partly a West Coast book.
Yeah, you
partly a New York City book.
You may not be as well known as some writers to our audience. So, recap for me. Where'd you come from, and how did you get to this place?
Where are you born going? What do you
born
want?
in California?
No, but we moved there when I was 10, and I think of myself as being from California. About the time I sort of stopped living in my parents' house and backyard and started living in a bigger world. That world was Southern California, and I love it. It's where I come from. It's what I escaped from. I live mostly happily in New York, to whatever extent you can live happily in New York. But I feel at this point, I think anyone who's moved around must feel this to some degree. Like, I'm not from California anymore, and I'm not from New York either. I've never really become a New Yorker. I still wander the streets of the city in which I've lived for almost 20 years and look around me and think, oh my God, it's like this? Really?
Well,
I like that.
Tell me something about your sort of the formal notions of your life. Where did you go to high school? Where did you go to college? And did you study writing as a formal discipline?
You know, I went to high school, a public high school in Southern California, where it was the 60s, and they pretty much let us do whatever we wanted, which seemed like a good idea at the time. Though it really, if it wasn't for that tough, mean girl I had a big crush on, I would never have read Woolf. I would only have read, I don't know, I would have written papers on the lyrics of Bob Dylan and Simon and Garfunkel throughout my high school career.
People did.
Yeah. And it got me something, but it wasn't much of an education really. But I did read Woolf and got started as a reader. I went to Stanford, and was not an especially happy camper there, and not an especially good student. I shudder to think at the education that was paraded in front of me, which I mostly chose to ignore. And just couldn't wait to get out and live in what I thought of as the world, which was not Stanford, which was not academics. I feel differently now, but at the time I just want to live everywhere and not here. And I moved to Colorado and Nebraska and Greece and all over the place, beginning to try to write. And finally sort of washed up in New York, where I have been all this time, laboring away. The Hours is my fourth novel, and as I wrote it, all I could think was, well, this odd little book with 3 points of view, and one of them is Virginia Woolf, and there's no sex and no car chases. This little book, if I'm lucky, will sell a few thousand copies, and then retire gracefully to the remainders table. I never imagined the Pulitzer Prize. I never imagined that there's now 1 million copies in print in the U.S.
Is that right?
And another 500,000 abroad. They're making this kind of big movie out of it.
It sounds like a Merchant and Ivory movie in its own way. As you say, no car chases, no wrecks, very little violence.
I wouldn't want to say anything. I would never say anything derogatory about any artist. I hope it's going to be a little livelier than some.
Oh, well, actually, I like Merchant and Ivory movies.
Yeah, I don't especially.
All right.
I find them a little sedate.
It's got to be something in the line of The House of Mirth or Portrait of a Lady or something, because it is a very decorous, decorous book in that way.
What I hope they're doing with my book is not unlike what I did with Woolf's book, which is take a purported work of art and love it and respect it with enough sort of ferocity to mess around with it. To not simply stuff and mount it, but to do something else with it.
Is this movie far enough along so that you actually know who's going to direct and who might
Oh
be
yeah,
in it? And
they're
who might
filming
be
it.
in it?
I know. Yeah.
Oh, can you say who's in it?
Half of it is filmed. I most certainly can. David Hare, the English playwright, did the screenplay, which is amazing. It's being directed by an English director named Stephen Daldry, who did Billy Elliot. And okay, here's the cast. This is slightly shocking.
Okay.
Meryl Streep, Nicole Kidman, Toni Collette, Ed Harris, Allison Janney, the woman from West Wing, Miranda Richardson, Claire Danes, and Toni Collette. It's a good cast.
It's amazing.
Yeah, it's an amazing
You're being
cast.
very well served here.
I am being probably better served than I deserve.
Have you been involved even as a spectator with the?
I've
have you been on
I've-
the set? Have you
I've-
consulted?
Okay, I've not only been on the set, they actually let me be in it for a second.
Oh, good.
I have a little tiny scene with Meryl Streep. Some people go the casting couch route. I wrote novels for 20 years in order to get into the movies.
Okay.
It's whatever works.
Oh, well, that's wonderful. Well, we'll be looking forward to that, and it should be in theaters in
They're going to
2002.
try to get it together by Christmas.
Oh, okay. End
What
of 2001.
What they're very conscious of right now is there's a big actor strike coming up
Yes.
in April, and they need to get all the scenes with the actors done by the end of March, and that's all anybody's worried about at the moment. But they're thinking if there's no bad surprises, they could have the movie together by Christmas.
Oh, well,
Nice little Christmas
Oh,
present.
that's fun. That's just something
Yeah.
to look forward to.
Yeah.
There is obviously plenty of Virginia Woolf. There's also, you can tell me if you think this is sensible, especially in this last book, a little Henry James, a little.
I love Henry James.
I'm not surprised to hear that.
Yeah.
I'm noticing it in not only in the patient pace, and it's not slow. It is in fact patient, but with an eye for the interior detail. I mean, you really do furnish a room. In your novels, people know what the wallpaper looks like.
Yeah.
They know what the carpet design is.
Yeah.
They know which rooms what the fabric is on the chairs and whether you like it or not.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, this has meaning for you. How do you, when you're doing that, how do you think as an artist? How do you think about what you're doing? What do you want the reader to get from those details, which a lot of readers would
Sure.
move over too quickly anyway?
Which is fine with me. I think a lot of it registers unconsciously, and that's great. What I'm trying to do is build the most convincing physical world I possibly can to try to get the reader, and I think, I want this from the books I read too. I want it as a reader just as surely as I want it for the people who read my stuff. I want the reader to forget that he or she is in a room in a town in the year 2001 and come over here, enter this world. And one of the ways I try to accomplish that is by rendering that world as palpably as I possibly can so that people can walk right in and feel entirely present in it.
Do you think that that the physical world, especially the chosen physical world, that is the shirt you choose to wear, the car you choose to own, the rug you choose to buy, do you think of yourself, or if you like, as a novelist, do you think that we live in physically symbolic worlds? Do you think that the material world has symbolic meaning?
Oh, sure. It's so much so that I can't quite imagine any working as a novelist and not believing that, believing that the gesture, the cufflinks, the eyeglasses, the car, everything says something about who the person is, and also fails to say anything about who the person is. I mean, one of the things I've learned, because you spend your whole life learning how to write a novel, and you die still trying to learn how to write a novel. But one of the things I love about the process is the fact that I just labor away at trying to get the details right and create believable characters and either manage it or don't manage it. But sooner or later when I'm writing about a person, I always come up against the fundamental mystery of that person that is more than the sum total of the cufflinks and the car and the glasses and the gesture. The soul, for lack of a more creative term.
But it's interesting. There are people who think that clothes make the man, and then there are Henry David Thoreaus of this world who think that the material world is basically of no consequence. And novelists have to move towards the importance of the material world.
Thoreau was not a novelist.
That's right.
He chose his profession well. And I think those of us who write fiction are just almost by definition immersed in the physical world.
I cannot imagine you. We don't know one another, but I cannot imagine you as a political conservative. It doesn't seem that way to me. The question is this. There's nothing too subtle about it. Your book, The Hours, depends. It can be read by someone who's never heard of Virginia Woolf, but I'm certain, and I think you're certain as well, that the reader who knows the most about Woolf, the reader who has read Mrs. Dalloway, is the reader who's going to get the most out of The Hours and like it the best. E.D. Hirsch, the Virginia professor, who is a fairly conservative fellow in some ways, put out a number of years ago a philosophy which he called cultural literacy, and it really involved Americans sharing certain canonical reading, sharing certain information so that we can make references, so that we can make allusions. It's a way of talking. Your novel depends on that, in part at least, depends on that way of talking.
Yeah.
How do you, what do you think about the idea of a shared cultural referent or cultural literacy? Is that an appealing idea to you?
Yes, though I don't know. I feel like I have one foot in a high culture and one foot somewhere else. Where I feel, just do I want to read a 10,000-page stream of consciousness novel? No. I just want to have a hot dog, and watch TV. It was important to me that The Hours work for people who don't know and don't care about Virginia Woolf, that it stand on its own.
Okay, and I think it can.
And it does have a bigger, deeper life for people who know the book. A lot of people have told me that after they read my book, they went back and read Mrs. Dalloway. Mrs. Dalloway was even turning up on some bestseller lists for a while. And I think maybe the greatest thing about the surprising success of this book is what it implies about who's out there reading books. There is this notion among novelists and publishers that there are no readers out there for any book that doesn't, or there's just such a tiny body of readers that they barely count, at least by the publisher's standards, which are all commercial. The American attention span has shrunk to almost to its own vanishing point. That you have to keep people constantly jolted and constantly titillated in order to get them to read a book. And lo and behold, here's 1 million people who want to read this unorthodox, slightly difficult book. And that is the best possible news for me and for all the writers I know.
Yes. Well, you're 4 novels down now and moving along very well. What's next? What are you doing now?
I've just started a new book. As you might imagine, all this fuss about the last book has been wonderful. It'd be crazy to complain about it, but a little daunting too.
You've been on the road.
Yeah. And when you write a book that is very well received, there's always the question about what's going to happen with your next book. And the answer is usually everyone will hate your next book. And I decided, well, fine, then I'm free. Everyone's going to hate the next book, so I can write whatever I want. And I'm working on it'll change as I write, things always do. And I couldn't talk about it at great length, but it involves genres. It's three linked stories. One a horror story, one a sort of lurid romance, and one a science fiction story. As someone who sort of battles what we were talking about a few minutes ago about like categorization. Are you a gay writer or are you a writer? Well, I'm a writer, but I don't want to completely deny that other part of my life. I'm especially interested in the whole notion of which books get put where in the bookstore, and so who reads them. I know of a number of extraordinary science fiction writers, Ursula Le Guin, Samuel Delany, people most of my friends haven't read or have barely heard of because they're on that shelf over there. And if they were on this shelf with the serious novels, I guarantee you somebody like Samuel Delany would not be working in the obscurity that he works in today.
Sells a lot of books, though.
To science fiction people, upon whom I do not mean to throw even a lick of shade, but you know what I mean.
Sure.
He has an audience, and no one I know in my sort of highfalutin New York literary circles reads him.
We categorize this as not being taken seriously. Is that a fair way to put it?
Yeah. I don't see the Sunday New York Times Book Review doing a front page story on Samuel Delany's latest book, or even reviewing it.
And you think that a genre novel, science fiction, mystery, cowboy, doesn't matter. If it's good enough, it should be.
Yeah, I think we're missing some of the great books because we only read this, and I suspect people who only read science fiction are missing some of the great stuff from the. It cuts both ways. I'm interested in playing around with those boundaries a little bit.
So, are you telling the same story in three different ways? Are you telling three interrelated stories?
It's three very subtly interrelated stories. So I like the idea of telling the same story three different ways. I just hadn't thought of that. No, they're very. It would be possible to read the book without even knowing that the stories were related, but the careful reader will see.
This has been a great pleasure.
And for me.
I'm so glad you could do this. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.